So great to be together every week. Hey, I'm possessive of every minute I get to spend with you. So I'm going to go ahead and start today. Welcome. Welcome to week 10. The Blessed Giveaway. This might be one of my favorite modules. Um, yeah, it's so rich. The Blessed Giveaway. And today we're going to start with a um, embodiment practice, as usual. Who here has a regular gratitude practice? Anybody work with gratitudes regularly? Baba, Mary Marty, Becky, awesome. All right. So if you really tune into the somatics of gratitude, it really is about receiving. It's about how much can we open our hearts, our bodies, our lives to receiving the gifts of life. So I want you to, as we do some embodiment meditation around gratitudes, I really want you to feel the soma, feel the somatics of it. And the neuro, the sort of new neuro understanding of how we change pathways in the brain is that we savor things. What fires together, wires together. So as we go through these gratitudes, I'm going to give each gratitude, I'm going to offer you prompts and give each one of them about 15 seconds to really wire in and um, see if you can't really just feel it in your system. So begin by finding a comfortable seat. You're welcome to close your eyes or soft gaze them. Let me just begin by noticing breath. And let's start with a feeling of general gratitude. Just call in the flavor and feeling of gratitude. Noticing how it's an act of receiving. And begin to tune into your heartbeat and notice how it's steady and constant for you. See if you can notice some gratitude for your heartbeat. And how about your eyes? Bring in some gratitude for the gift of sight. And imagine something that you see, that you've seen in your life, a color you love, or a shape, or a sight in nature that brings you delight. See if you can experience some gratitude. And think of a scent, something you love to smell. beautiful aroma that's meaningful to you. See if you can have some gratitude for that. For the folks who are just getting here, we're in a gratitude practice. We're receiving in our bodies a sense of gratitude. How about a sound? Tune into the sounds around you and how many sounds can you be grateful for? Moving to touch and texture. Think of a hug you've recently shared, or the fabric touching your body, or cuddling with a pet, or being warm in your bed. See if you can feel the soma, deep gratitude for touch and texture. Think of someone who loves you dearly. See if you can let that in and feel grateful for that. And think of someone you love dearly. Another really prime gratitude practice is imagining, calling to mind all of the ways you've been supported in this life by the earth itself, by air and water, by the microorganisms in and on and around you, supporting your life. Those just arriving, we're doing a gratitude practice, somatic based receiving. If you can call to mind gratitude for the food that you've recently eaten, that's kept you alive, that's supported you, by all the learning in your life. See if you can call to mind gratitude for the abundance that's flowed towards you every day of your life, and the abundance that's flowed from you. Call to mind all of the ways that you feel safe or secure at this very moment. Just if you feel a difference in your presence. And as you begin to transition back, just very, very gently open your eyes and find an object around you that you feel grateful for and savor that. And find another object around you and savor that. Hmm. Right, and coming back to the group. How many people got the gratitude endorphins flowing? So good, so good. Our quote of the week is from Eckhart, no, Meister Eckhart. And he says, if the only prayer you ever say in your entire life is thank you, it will be enough. If the only prayer you ever say in your entire life is thank you, it will be enough. Can you feel that? You feel the receptivity of thank you. Receptivity is one of the most important characteristics for a good death and a good life. Thank you for being on that journey with me. I feel all endorphined too. Oof. Yummy. Who would like to share a beloved dead this week? Someone who has not shared a beloved dead. Anybody? Becky Lubold?
So, oops.
We lost your camera. There you go.
I see that. Yeah. So I'd like to share my mother. And this, I don't know if you can see, this is her family picture.
Yes, we can see.
My mother's mother and father and her brother. And this is actually my mother. Her name is Roseanne Lubold. And I've been thinking a lot about my family. November 11th was the day that my mother's mother died. My mother at this time in November of 2021, she was in the hospital during COVID, very disoriented at age 91. My mother was an amazing woman. She had 10 children in 15 and a half years. She started her own business, a catering deli bakery business that ran for over 35 years. And she passed in April of 2022. And taking this class, about this time in November, when she returned from the hospital, we realized she needed 24/7 care at home. So I took on the task of coordinating that for her, and a number of my siblings and hired helpers did that for her until she passed, which was a really difficult thing for her, but she was really amazing. And I think in terms also of the fact that my mother's parents were immigrants, and a lot of what they brought to her and to me was a sense of a very strong work ethic, a very strong sense of being connected to nature and natural things. And so I'm grateful. I really feel gratitude for all that became me as a result of who they were.
And was it Roseanne? Did I get that
Yes,
right?
that's right.
Roseanne Lubold. And where did she grow up and where was she when she died?
She actually grew up in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and she died in Indiana, Pennsylvania, which is just east of where I live now.
Indiana, Pennsylvania. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you,
Family
Roseanne.
stayed there. Yeah.
Blessings, Roseanne. Thank you. So I got a good snapshot of her. Thank you so much.
Thank you for letting me share.
This enriches us all. Yeah, so this is our quote for today. The only prayer you ever say in your entire life is thank you. It is the only prayer. That's how I see it. It is the only prayer. It is the only prayer. Hmm. So before we get into our topic for today, we spent 2 modules, 2 whole weeks caring for the dead. Oh, Meredith was so lovely to have last week. I get tired of listening to myself. It was lovely to have her. We talked a lot about organ donation, which was interesting and a little surprising to me. Um, yeah, and your homework has been to research and contemplate after death, disposition of body options, the disposition of body forms, caring for your own at death, contemplations. What small things would you like to weave in with your beloved dead or to have woven in as you die? Specific wishes for your transition and writing your own eulogy, which is on my to-do list as well. Any thoughts, questions, contemplations about all of that? Still in
I
process, I'm guessing.
I have one. I started on my eulogy, and I have done this before, thought about the threads that have gone through my life, things that I started when I was 18 or 30, and how they've continued through the decades. And thinking of Carole King's Tapestry song and writing it as if I'm weaving and creating the picture of my life through a tapestry of threads.
Oh,
And then remember the line, my tapestry's unraveling. They've come to take me back. Isn't that beautiful?
yeah. We should,
That's the basis of my eulogy.
I love it. We should put that tapestry song into the Spotify list. That's
Yes,
a great
please.
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I have
awesome.
fun with that.
Yay. The threads. So we spent a lot of weeks on the first category, designing our sacred decline, and that wove practical and mystical pieces together. We spent 2 weeks on returning the vessel, and could probably do 2 more, but this is where we are. And 1 week on the Blessed Giveaway, even though, again, we could spend 13 weeks on the Blessed Giveaway. Um, it's a big bucket. The reason I don't spend more time here is I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an accountant. We are having a guest today come again, my friend Scott Lamb, who's a lawyer, a trust and estate lawyer, and we can ask all kinds of questions because I don't know I don't know more than I know. So yeah, I'm gonna do a few things with you, and then if we need to run into next week with this, we will do that because it may be more than we can digest today. Um, and I want to remind you of your checklist because this is last week and the things that you need doing around end of life paperwork, as well as this week. Your checklist is going to come in handy for yourself as you make notes like, oh, I really want to do this and I would like to do it by then. And bring this to your buddy. Your buddy is there. Help remind each other that you're there to help complete these practical pieces. So if you haven't gotten the checklist out with your buddy, do that regularly. Okay. The Blessed Giveaway. Um, there's 2 major intentions I have for this module. It's thick, and what the first major intention I have is to give you peace of mind. Right. When we think of end of life documents, the first thing people often think about is a will. What am I going to do with my stuff, my money? And then the second major intention I have for the Blessed Giveaway is to make it easy on the folks you leave behind. And this is no small thing. Has anybody ever dealt with a big mess that somebody else left behind financially or with stuff. It's awful. And the context, now that you know the context of death in this from this course, is that folks are grieving because you've died and they're dealing with this earthly existence. You've not a care in the world and they have to sit on hold with customer service. So, like, don't do that to people. you know, um, if you make if you make it easier on them, they're more likely to be able to grieve and receive from your death. If they're running around trying to get bank numbers and probate and all of this other stuff, they're not going to really be able to settle in to the process of grieving your death. So it's a gift for them. It's a huge gift. Here's the thing about talking about money. Money and things is that it brings up anxiety for folks. So if you're feeling anxiety about this module, then you can maybe turn off sound on and off. Maybe stay nearby, move your body around, go back and listen as you can. Keep moving energy through your body. And the other piece is that what kind of support can you get for the blessed giveaway? How can we find a way to make this more embodied and more delightful? People are out there to support you, right? If you need to have a somatic session to move through the anxiety that's there about stuff and money, you can come to me. We can work through that. You can go to another somatic person. And then once you're able to do that, then you can have a financial person get to the basics. So here's some of my blessed giveaway goals, my high dream goals, my goals for myself, and you're welcome to borrow these. I'd like to leave little to no mess for others to deal with, physically or financially. I'd like a low to no stress offering of what I've accumulated and accomplished in this life. Meaning, for people who are left behind, can I give them something beautiful, whether that's money or some kind of gift that I've accumulated or accomplished? And to lean into small but meaningful remembrances. How can I do this in an easy and fun way that it can be nourishing to me when I plan for it and nourishing to others when they receive it? How can my life and what I leave behind be a blessing? I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. My friend Mary Lane, who I have taught with, she has pared her life down to anything she can fit in her car. And each one of those things has either a practical value, which can get given to Goodwill or moved on, or a ceremonial spiritual value. And she got a group of women friends together, 4 or 5 of us, and we went through all the things that meant something to her, and we either claimed it or we suggested someone that she could give it to, and it was all written down. She's not dying, at least not at this moment. So that was very sweet. That was a very sweet experience. Another one was my friend Kimchi. She also pared things down, gave things away before she died. And then once she died, there was a big auctiony giveaway thing in our community. She was an artist, so she had beautiful fabrics and beautiful art and jewelry. And I have, we had this silent auction thing where we would put our name down on certain things and we would get up to 3 things. And I was really wanting some of her art. And so I got all 3 pieces that I wanted of her art, and it's on my walls, and I'm completely surrounded by her every single day of my life. I'm surrounded by her art. I've bought other pieces from her. I probably have I don't know, 8 or so pieces of her art in my in my spaces. And it's really meaningful to me. Really, really meaningful. So let me stop here because I'm going to go through a few things today, but I just want to stop here and just see how everyone's doing when we think about the blessed giveaway, when we think about stuff and money. What comes up for folks? Stuff and money.
There's a few things coming up for me. The first one is that I, at least if I were to die now, that I don't have, much to leave. Before I went to Mexico, I got called to Mexico. I got called to downsize. And I say called because it was just like I had no choice. It was like something was driving me. Um, and now that I'm back here, I'm noticing some more accumulation back in LA and, being mindful of that and also wanting to get back to the apartment where my daughter is and getting rid of more stuff. And what's really coming up for me right now is, I had this client a dozen years ago. I can't remember if I've shared this before, but she just happened to be dying. And she was my client for a year. I wasn't a death doula or anything at that time. I was, a spiritual coach, and had a year with her. And she gave me for my birthday one year a necklace. And then when I got called into her house when, like, the last week of her life, which was not planned at all. I mean, this is definitely what started me on this trajectory, even though it was a dozen years ago. And she gifted me a card, just the best she could do, to write thanks for the journey, Satya, and gifted me $10,000, which was huge, and has made a huge impact on me on many levels. But this necklace, I fucking gave it away when I was leaving for Mexico. I was just like, and now I'm like, I know who has it. And as I'm sitting here listening, I'm like, I want it back. So I've already been sort of contemplating reaching out to my friend, who I feel will be a little hesitant, to be honest. but as I'm now that I'm on this journey in a different way, so intentionally, and realizing on a different level, like the importance of that moment with Kathy, that year moment, that is one of the things I would like to have touching me.
Yeah, well, maybe you can give something precious as an exchange,
Yeah, like a trade.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And she's
Yeah.
who will get it, but also I think it won't be, just an easy yes. So
Thank you, Satya.
thank you.
Yeah, I think I see you, Heather, and I see you, Carl. You're next. Yeah, I think, this giveaway, Native traditions have a real giveaway ethos, right? We have in our modern culture, we have a bit of a hoarding ethos, and one of the downsides of that is now we have to deal with our hoarding. And so how can we adopt giveaway culture? What are some practices, whether it's money or things? Anyway, that's what your share brings up for me, Satya. Thank you. Heather, go ahead.
I'm just going to quickly share that around the money piece. In reflecting on my paternal grandmother's death, that got really nasty. And to the point where I'm just naming this because it happens, but my father was actually the POA and in charge of finances and all of that. And then when my grandmother moved in with my uncle and my aunt, they somehow roped her into signing paperwork where my uncle became the POA and in charge of finances. And long story short, they ended up stealing money from my grandmother and from um, all the grandchildren in terms of like the giveaway that she wanted to offer us. And so it's just kind of been this like big little secret in our family. No one's really addressed it. None of the grandchildren have. I haven't. But more than anything, I was just like, wow, how can it's like, it was like a part of my aunt and uncle that were so hyper focused on the finances and getting what they think they thought they deserved. And those parts of them kind of cast out everyone else. So yeah, it's really nuanced and tricky and hard in certain ways.
Yeah.
There's of course positive stories and outcomes, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds really painful. I appreciate your vulnerable share, Heather. And, if we feel like we're running out of shadow content at any point in our lives, we could always look at our relationship with money. So this brings up, death and sex and money, right? Like this is the juice. Death meets finances. Thank you. And you're not alone, Heather. Lots and lots of families go through that. Yeah, Carl, go ahead.
I'm wrestling with the idea of I have two nephews and a niece, and my two nephews have kids. I'm wrestling with the idea of excluding one of my nephews from my will, maybe include his wife and their kids. And so I'm just dealing with that, how that would look, and dealing with that. So.
Yeah, that's a complex thing to contemplate. And do you bring that up or do you not bring that up? Do you let it be a surprise? Do you say anything in your will about why? Those are really beautiful questions. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. Yeah. So I want to tiptoe into these a little bit at a time so we don't get overwhelmed. Let me share my screen again. Okay. So there's lots of components to the Blessed Giveaway. I'm gonna do beneficiaries first. It's a small little chunk that we can do ourselves that we don't need a lawyer for. It's not very complicated, and I hope it's gonna warm us up a little bit. And I have this little slide. And basically any kind of accounts that you have, whether that's an IRA or life insurance, annuity, retirement plan is one category here. They call it different things. So they call it beneficiary on those accounts, and they call it TOD or transfer on death with any kind of other investment account, and they call it POD, although beneficiary would help them understand on checking accounts and savings accounts and money market accounts. So something I didn't realize until I started studying end of life issues is that they won't ask you about beneficiaries when you open any of these accounts for the most part. Some annuities, some retirement plans will ask you, but you can invest in all kinds of things, including, I have 7 different checking accounts for different areas of my life. Like I had to go to the bank to say, can I please list a beneficiary or a POD? And then if I decide I want to change that, then I need to actively go and do that again. So this is something we can all do. It's going to take a little administrative chutzpah, a little like oomph to, call these places. Generally speaking, they all work similarly, which is they transfer to the beneficiary upon your death. And the death certificate generally needs to be presented to these institutions. And in all of these cases, if the death certificate and the ID that you present match what the account holder had as their beneficiary, then that account just seamlessly transfers over. Boop, no problem. Where it's tricky is if there's no beneficiary listed or if there's a beneficiary listed that somebody else is then fighting, right? This happened to my friend Chuck Marsh, who's one of the founders of Earth Haven, who died. And very tragic story that the oncologist wasn't really telling him the truth about how long he had. And so he was dead within a month of getting a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. And none of us really got it together to support him. And he had had a really bitter divorce, really still in the throes of distrust and resentment and bitterness towards his ex. And she got the life insurance policies because he hadn't changed the name. And then she ended up fighting in court a bunch of other stuff too. It was a glorious mess. And these are really easy to do. For those of you who have accounts, they're very easy to do. I just went to my bank and said, hey, I'd like to name a beneficiary for these accounts. They were like, great. Some of these annuities, retirement plans, life insurance, you're probably going to have to call, prove your identity, and then talk to them. And if you think you don't have a beneficiary, you might be surprised. Maybe you did something 20 years ago and don't remember. Any questions about that? Stop sharing. The only thing that will trump beneficiaries on account is if you have a joint account holder. Yeah. That's one thing that Kimchi did towards the end of her life is she put me on as a joint account holder on all of her accounts. So then it just belonged to me once she died. And I had all the privileges of a joint account holder. So that's another option.
Lee, I noticed too with my Roth IRA account, there was the option of listing multiple beneficiaries. And so you can like split the amount in which you gift,
That's
or
awesome.
if the person you list is, if the first person you list dies, then there are like two backups. So yeah.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Probably complicated and a little confusing. I mean, here's the thing that these institutions can't tell you who's on the list unless you're that person. This is something that happened to us also. Someone else at Earth Haven died and had listed what she wanted done with all the money. And so this was like she had an account at the local First Bank, our local bank. And we, who I forget which one of us was handling this. I think it was Carmen. And they went in and said, here's the death certificate. We'd like this money. I'm the executor of this person's estate. And that they're like, I'm sorry, we have somebody else listed as the beneficiary. And she was like, who? And they were like, we can't tell you. And so it was like months, maybe even years. I'm like, is it this person? Is it this person? I think it was like 2 or 3 years later, and it was another member of our community that no one had suspected. And they finally were able to access the money, and then that person gave it to the executor to do what she wanted with it. But yeah, it's really good to write those things down. What I've done is written all my accounts, their account numbers, what I had used that account for, and then who I had listed as the beneficiary. I just have like a little spreadsheet. So someone can decipher and find their way through it. Becky.
I just wanted to share how well it worked before my mother died. she had come to live with us the last few years of her life. And my husband does estate planning, and
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
or joint accounts. So she said, well, this child can be joined in that account, and that child's joined on this account, and this child is joined on that account, and kind of balanced out the amounts of money. And then this child is a co-owner of this land with me, and so they inherited when she died. The only thing we missed was the car, to make somebody joint on the title of the car.
Mm-hmm.
But it just made it. And the other thing that I was going to share is the more everyone can know what the plans are and understand the thinking, it avoids family squabbles later on a lot of times. So it's
Yeah.
helpful to share all this ahead of time.
So your husband is an estate planner, and you blipped out for a minute, but you're saying that he helped her get all this in order. Is that right?
Probably not. I mean, just like you said, you can go to the bank and do all these things. And if
Right.
you think of everything ahead of time, you don't even have to open an estate.
Right.
So
Yeah, I
that
really,
simplifies.
I really love what you're saying about letting if there's some concern about letting your children or your beloveds know ahead of time, if you have some trepidation about that, that might be a clue that there's going to be unease about it after you die. Right? If you feel good about it and there's alignment, or even better, if there's choice, hey, how do y'all feel about this? This is my best thinking here. You know, this is my attempt at equity and fairness and creating ease among everyone. If you can have that conversation ahead of time, what a blessing. What a blessing. Thank you, Becky. Dave.
So I think I know the answer to this, but if you have a charity as your person that's the beneficiary, do they have to contact the institution with the death certificate or something?
That's a really great question. That's a really great question. Um, let's save that question for Scott.
Okay.
I'm thinking like, yeah, I did my will online, and I'll share the link with you. And at the end, it's saying, like the question I have is, would you will that money to your residuary estate and then have your executor distribute that to the charity, or would that beneficiary be the charity? That's a great question. Let's save that. Very good. Thank you. While you're at it, I'm going to do another easy one here. While you're at it with this, sort of simple paperwork, you are going to need to let somebody know your master password. Um, there was a comedian that did a book. Well, I'll have to find the name of it. And she had a whole chapter on passwords and like her father's crazy passwords and not knowing them. But I just have my master password to my Gmail account, and then I have my code to my phone, right? If someone in your life can get into your phone and can get into your major email account, then um they can get, verification, confirmation emails, and like then they can sort of do whatever they need to do. But if they can't get into anything, it's tricky. It's tricky. So what I just did is I just took an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and hand wrote those two things, the login for my phone and the login for my Gmail. And that's it. Just handwritten in my end of life paperwork. I didn't print out a whole thing of passwords. I didn't do any of that. I felt like that's enough, and they can get, and the reason it's handwritten is that I don't want it anywhere digital. I just wanted it sort of in my actual paperwork. I didn't want it to be out there in a PDF with my people. I just right there in the folder, there it is. I mean, and I live with my partner so he can get into my phone and, wait, have each other's phones password and get into my computer, but that's not the case for everyone. All right, we just did 2 small pieces. We'll stop here. Any other questions about these? We just basically did a whole beneficiaries piece, which is a do-it-yourself kind of thing. I highly recommend you do it. And let's ask Scott about that question. Like, if you don't have next of kin or friends that you're giving it to, can the beneficiary be a charity, or should you have your executor get it and then they distribute? That's a really good question. So we just did beneficiaries and we just did passwords stuff. Any questions or thoughts about any of that? Good. Y'all are hanging in there. All right, let's take 6 minutes. So 52 after the hour, we'll be back. Okay. So, another one that's worth mentioning is arranging for pets. I think the simple version of this one is just see who in your friend or family group is a pet lover and ask them if they would be willing to make sure your pet is taken care of. That's a simple version. I did put some links and resources in the resource section for today, week 10, there's a couple of good articles. And you can go so far as to create a trust for your pet where you have money in it and you assign someone and drop documents and all kinds of stuff. That is certainly an option. But it might just be someone that loves you and someone that enjoys pets, and maybe they're not even the person that takes them, but just that they make sure that your pet goes somewhere that you would feel good about. And you could write it up. This is the thing about end of life paperwork. You don't have to have a specific form, although you may search online and find one. But if you just say, listen, Fido goes to Stacy or whatever, just writing it down. You can put them in your will and in trusts. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do, but it can be simpler than that too. Arranging for children is a whole different thing. If anyone has underage children and or plans to, or knows someone that does, you need a guardianship plan. You need more like a family estate plan. And the first thing you really need to do is to think about who would you be okay raising your child, right? Who shares your values? Who would that be? And it doesn't, if you and the other parent die at the same time, then yes, it would be, unless you specify that child, it would probably go to the state to determine next of kin, right? Which may or may not be something that you want. There's lots to consider: economics, family dynamics, the familiarity of your child with someone. But there are certain criteria for guardians. They need to be an adult. They need to be at least 18. They need to be able to fulfill their duties as a guardian, and then they need to be able to provide for the child. So, you need to really look for who in your world stable enough and can provide the kind of emotional support that your child would no doubt need in a situation like that. Yeah. So that's a very, very special circumstance. All right. I think that's the end of the easy ones. I'm gonna stop share here. Anyone have any thoughts, comments, sharings around Linny? You're muted, love, love.
I was remembering back in the day, many ago, we were advised to have a second separate person that handled the money to raise those kids. Two, a brother and a sister or whatever, but distinctly two different, which we did. Yeah.
That's interesting. That makes a lot of sense to me. That you'd have like a trust, some kind of trust set up, or that it would be in the hands of someone that was more neutral about that, and then the folks who were guardians of the kids. That does make a lot of sense. Yeah. I have been asked twice in my life to be on on someone's will for caring for their child, and if the both parents were to die. Yeah, it's been an interesting journey to go through that with parents, to really feel into like, am I, and the more recent one actually was just a couple of years ago, and I said no, but I would be willing to be the person that helped set that child up into a situation that felt aligned. That I wasn't willing to be a guardian of the child, but I was willing to create a situation. A situation. So, yeah, that's an interesting journey to go through with parents. Yeah, your daughter-in-law freaks out when I bring that up. She can't go there. Yeah, I hear that. I hear that. It's really scary stuff to have to wade through. Yeah. Anybody else? Anything on pets? Anything on pets, passwords, beneficiaries? Yeah, Lenny, go ahead.
I also noticed that when you adopt a dog from, for instance, a rescue, a puppy mill dog, they are very firm about wanting that dog to go back there.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like a shelter, like a humane society kind of thing?
Well, I don't know about Humane Society. It could well be. I almost can remember that as well. But definitely for some of these privately run rescue groups where they just deal with, for instance, Havanese, or they just deal with border collies, and they're really particular. So it's worth just knowing. I mean, they wouldn't know you died, obviously, but
I
to
think
honor that.
yeah, my sense is what they're saying is that they are oriented towards that particular breed, and they know best how to rehome that breed. And someone else, taking that on because they loved you may not be a good fit. That's my sense.
Especially for a puppy mill dog, which is a little bit of a challenge. Yeah.
Right. Right. Welcome, Scott. I don't know if we can hear you. Can you say something else again? No. Is anybody else hearing Scott? No. All right, that's fine. I will just do a little intro. Scott is a dear friend of myself and Damon Sean, and he is totally just volunteering to connect with us today. He does estates and trusts, so you certainly could reach out to him, but he's just trying to answer some of our questions, and I love this because I have no idea what I'm talking about with any of this stuff. So How about that? Can we hear you now? No. Weird. Hmm. Maybe turn your volume up. Or maybe you have, what else could be going on?
How about that? Did that come through?
Yay, yes.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Now let me see if I can get my video back. Let's see. Oh, okay,
There you
wonderful.
are.
That work?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, super. My
Yeah.
apologies.
Yeah, so welcome. We've spent a little bit time today talking about beneficiaries and um arranging for pets and kids, and we're on week 10 of a 13-week class, and the title of this week is called The Blessed Giveaway. And we haven't yet talked about financial or durable POA. We haven't talked about trusts and wills, and already folks have had a couple of questions that I think would be great for you. But maybe you could just start by just, I don't know, introducing yourself.
Certainly. So my name is Scott Lamb, and I have practiced in trust and estates since law school. I was a counselor before law school, and so I mainly help people and families consider and plan for, meditate on death, and then afterwards to be able to move forward. So depending on what the amount of planning might be, being able to help individuals and families sort of move through the process. So,
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and of the things that you and I talked about, like we talked about just like a little bit of an overview,
sure.
like we hadn't yet touched on a POA, which as you all might remember is power of attorney, but instead of a healthcare power of attorney, people making decisions about what will happen to you when you're ill or declining, this is a financial POA, right? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that works, Scott.
Sure. So you all may have covered this, but just to consider that a person can plan for having someone else make decisions for them when they're not able to. And those can be in two main areas. One is medical decisions, and the other is for financial decisions. And these are all decisions that you can appoint or nominate someone else to make for you while you're alive. And so they can be extremely helpful. They also avoid the process of what's called guardianship, where if a person is incompetent or incapacitated, someone else, the state then appoints someone to make those decisions. So it's a way to be proactive in thinking about our incapacity or needing help with those. So the healthcare power of attorney is exclusively for the body. So healthcare decisions, mental health treatment, living will provisions, which is end of life, being able to choose how we pass. Those are all included within the healthcare power of attorney and with a living will. The other is the general power of attorney, which is the financial document. And that's also called sometimes a durable power of attorney because it's durable. It outlasts a person's incapacity or incompetence. So if I were to sign one today and then I became incompetent, that document would outlast my incompetency. So it's durable. And it allows someone to appoint another individual or more than one to serve as agent or to serve as their voice when they might need it in making financial transactions.
Right. And what's your recommendation on should the health care or medical power of attorney be the same person as the financial power of attorney, or do you suggest making those different people?
Great question. Usually I have found over the years that it depends on the people that are available and their proximity. So having a healthcare power of attorney, naming someone who is semi-local can be very helpful and useful if you need them to sign you into doctor's appointments or to approve certain medications. So it can be someone that might be more familiar with your healthcare or your own personal living condition. A financial power of attorney doesn't necessarily need to be local or someone that's always physically available, just someone that's generally willing and able to sort of handle managing someone else's finances. As far as the same person, it really depends on the individual. Oftentimes, I'll have folks that if they have more than one children, they might want to split. They might name one as their healthcare power of attorney and the other as their financial. If a client is married, almost always their partner or their spouse, if they're in relationship, is the person who's most familiar with their healthcare and sometimes with their finances. And so naming the other partner as primary agent is very helpful in that way. But it certainly does not have to be the case. It can be a spouse, it can be a friend, it can be a sibling, it can be a child. I generally recommend that there's at least one person who's in the younger generation. So for myself, that would be my children, just so that I have a line of succession, so that if I name someone and something happens to them, that there's not a vacancy. So being able to have a primary and then a backup and then even a backup to the backup.
Yeah. We've done a lot around the healthcare medical power of attorney, and we even have talked about, sort of a death care team or a end of life care team, where we pull that together and with multiple people. But just to be super clear, like this is the person that can authorize checks being written to an institution. The financial or durable power of attorney is the one that's going to be able to make the money available for your care when you are deemed incapable of, right?
Great question. And it actually comes together because healthcare is generally just healthcare decisions. The general durable or financial would just be financial. But let's say someone is being admitted to a facility. That requires both the healthcare agent to sign that they do need this level of treatment and that their agent approves it, but then oftentimes needs the financial power of attorney to sign off saying, I'm willing to help them pay for it. So oftentimes they're split, but in certain circumstances, they're almost one and the same.
Yeah, there's going to be some collaboration between these two people if they're different. So make sure they're at least speaking to each other and ideally collaborating to your best interest.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there is a section, at least in most of the power of attorneys, where certainly with the healthcare, where it references working with the general power of attorney, and it authorizes and directs them to do that. So.
Right. Yeah, Lumen has a question, and I think you've already spoken to this, but the durable versus irrevocable POA.
Great question. So generally, a power of attorney is as active, effective as soon as it's signed. However, with a power of attorney, you can either have it as durable, meaning it outlasts a person's incompetence or incapacity. So it's effective today as soon as it's signed, and then it outlasts. So ultimately until that person's death, the principal's death. There can also be a springing power, which is one that just comes into being or comes into life at some point in the future. So it wouldn't be a durable, it would be a general power of attorney. But when I become incapacitated or incompetent and my physicians say so, then that power comes into being. It comes alive. And then the agent, the person that I've nominated, can then make decisions for me once I've been determined to be incompetent.
So. Right. That's what probably many of us might want, which is I don't want people making decisions for me now, but when the time comes, I would like that.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And then how does one revoke it? Is it a matter of tearing up the old documents and making a new one? Or is there a form that we would fill out being like, I no longer want this person as my POA?
There is a way to affirmatively like terminate or void a power of attorney with a single document. However, usually what we do is we'll just execute a new one. And then it says all of my prior power of attorneys are now terminated.
Got it.
And so that's
Great.
usually how to update one. There's also a process of recording the financial or the general power of attorney with the Register of Deeds. And that can be helpful because it just gives the public knowledge that you do have a power of attorney, that this person is acting in your stead or will act, and that any financial institution or company or business, they would be able to look it up and verify that person's authority.
So you recommend that the Register of Deeds where someone lives is to register that POA?
I do in two situations. One, if they have a really good idea that the people that they've named will be the people that help them for life. And then if they have successors in the younger generation, then I know that document will last a long time. The other is if they're doing a specific transaction. So like signing a deed or a settlement statement, something like that, where having it recorded is required. So those are the two
Gotcha.
situations where I would recommend that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. And then just to let's sort of move towards the idea of an executor, so that the executor is handling things once you're gone, that the POA is in place when you're alive, the
Exactly.
executor's handling things when you're gone. And can you talk a little bit about the role of an executor? And I mean, I want to ultimately ask you about probate also, like what is probate and why does it happen? And, like how do people navigate once you're gone?
Great question. So it might be easier to start with the probate because having a will is helpful for several reasons. And once it gets, and I'll go over those in just a second, and once it gets admitted to the court, that's technically what's referred to as probate. And it's the process of verifying a person's will and then having the executor, in the case of a will, carry out those intentions according to the will itself. Now, probate also applies when a person doesn't have a will. So if I die without a will, there is a process for someone, usually my next of kin, to step up and to serve in that role. In North Carolina, it's referred to as an administrator. Whereas if you have a will, you can actually name an executor, but they serve essentially the same role. And that is to manage a person's property after their death. And so depending on the planning that was done and how a person's assets and property is titled and what their plan might have been, that determines how much work has to be done once a person dies. And the executor, someone that gets named in a will to do those tasks. And they can be as simple as, making sure that all of a person's mail has been received, filing their last year's tax return, carrying out the terms of their will, whether that might be if they have minor children, having a guardian named under the terms of a will, if there is a provision for pets or a pet trust, being able to provide in some way for their care and their maintenance. And then also to be able to dictate how one would like their property to pass. And that can be to named people. It can be to charities. It can be to a trust as a way to avoid probate almost altogether, which can have a lot of benefits, or a combination of those. So there's different things that can be included in that will, and it's what is admitted when the court begins the probate process. So not only is it collecting a person's assets and managing those, but if there's any debts or final expenses, those can get paid And the estate can really serve as as an entity, for lack of a better word, so that anything a person could do during life, an estate could do in different ways. So I don't want to get too complicated, but that's kind of the overall basics.
Yeah, so let's unpack some of those. That's really great, Scott. Thank you.
Sure.
The scenario where someone doesn't have a will but owns things, owns property, has assets, and they have nothing. Let's say they have defined nothing. The court is then like the ones to say, okay, we want to distribute it this and this way, or the children or the next of kin come and say, and it's like a whole huge, I imagine, like a much bigger process.
It definitely can be. It's one thing to consider is that we all have an estate plan if we don't override it with the actual document. So it's all by statute. So in other words, the North Carolina statutes basically lay out if a person dies and they don't have a will, these are the people who are what's called their natural bounty, the people that most likely would inherit from them. It would be a spouse, children, siblings, and there's a certain order depending on this who's in the surviving family.
Gotcha.
So it's very specific. It can get challenging because it can frustrate maybe one of the surviving family's intentions or maybe their ideas on what they should have gotten or someone else could. So it's a default plan, and it can sometimes be a bit more complicated to carry out. So it's certainly easier to name.
So the state has a defined path, a road that they travel if someone doesn't have a will. Got it. And then if they do have a will, but then someone's contesting or there's confusion or the executor's not willing, then all of that is still a process in court.
It is. And it's actually, so it's through the clerk of court. And so it's oftentimes why people will want to avoid probate. And when there's the talk of, gosh, I don't want to go through probate. Probate is, of course, the judicial or the court process for verifying authority and documents and also accounting. And that's what can make it extremely expensive, because when an estate goes through probate, we have to account for every penny, and we have to prove it through documents. So it can get very, time intensive and expensive.
And who pays for that?
Yeah, the estate is primarily responsible. So,
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And so the trust now, maybe you could, like, the trust is the only way to avoid probate, right? And it's illegal. Maybe you could define what that is.
Certainly. So a trust it's almost like creating a legal entity in and of itself. So if I created a revocable trust, it would still have my Social Security number, so my tax ID, but I could own property through that trust, and it would technically be separate from me. And it's revocable, so anything I put into it, I can take right back out of it. It's revocable, so I can change the terms of it at will. And in the document of that revocable trust, I can name who I would like to be trustee, and then what I would like them to do with the property that's in that trust. And that's a revocable trust. And irrevocable, like the name implies, is cannot be terminated as easily. There are ways to do it, but it's intended to be irrevocable. So as long as the terms would apply. So sometimes that's a lifetime, sometimes it's 30 years or more. So it just depends on the document. And then with a trust, there's always three roles. There's the creator, and that's the grantor. They create the trust. There's a trustee, and that person manages the trust property. And then there has to be a beneficiary. So a person or entity, if it's in the case of an organization or nonprofit, that receives the benefits from the trust. And those have to be, generally you can be the grantor and the trustee of your own revocable trust. You need to have an additional beneficiary besides yourself, which is usually the case. Somebody wants to name another person or persons or organizations to receive their property at death. So,
Right. Okay.
and then just to kind of go over, there's different ways to transfer title. One is through a contract, and that's what a trust is. It's an actual private contract. So it's between two parties. It's between the grantor, the trustee, and the beneficiary. So it doesn't go through court, and that can be a huge benefit in this way, because it just passes through contract and through the terms of the trust itself. You can also pass property through beneficiary designation. So if I name beneficiaries of my various properties and it's on the beneficiary form, then that happens automatically at my death once those companies receive the death certificate and the social security numbers for the beneficiaries. It happens automatically and it goes outside of probate.
Yeah.
And in North Carolina, real estate is also not considered a probate asset. So it technically doesn't pass through a person's estate. If I have a will that says I want my real estate to go to this person, and that's it, that's the only thing within my will and my estate, the will can be recorded and it passes title to that real estate without having to go through the whole process of probate.
Wow. Okay. All right,
Yeah.
then. And, my understanding is that a trust is a little bit more complicated to set up. And also we have this question about, like, let's put all of the healthcare medical stuff aside, but like hiring a lawyer to do a will versus a trust. Do you have any sense of like the complexity and the cost of the differences between those?
Certainly. So usually, roughly, on average, for a couple, for a will and advance directives, and those will be the healthcare power of attorney with a living will, and then also a financial. That's generally in the range of $1,000. And then with a revocable trust, in addition to what's called a pour over will, but it's designed to work with the trust, with those other same documents for a couple, it's generally 1,500. And oftentimes what I say to my clients is that, my biggest files are the ones of folks who didn't have their documents. And so their family is sort of left grappling with, well, what do we do now? So it can add a lot more uncertainty and then a lot more time and expense. And so I liken it to preventive medicine. So being able to do one's documents and set up a trust, that cost is saving at least 3 or 4 times that amount for their surviving family after death.
Right. Wow. So helpful. Is a domestic partner considered a spouse in the eyes of the law?
The domestic partner, no,
Okay.
not without. Yes, no, not without a marriage certificate.
Got it. Okay. That's super helpful.
And that being said, a trust is actually a really great creative way to basically do the same things as marriage, but underneath the terms of a trust. So in North Carolina, the only person an individual cannot disinherit is their legal spouse. They have a right to their partner or their spouse's estate, but no one else is entitled to anything from a person's estate. And so if a couple is not married, they can create some of the same rights and duties as marriage within the terms of a trust.
Got it. Okay. Helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Lumen says, my parents are dual citizens of 2 different states. They own real estate in each state. Does it make a difference law-wise where they die in terms of how their trust or will is executed?
No, probably the biggest factor would be where the successor trustee is located. So if the successor trustee, who would basically be picking up, the responsibility after the second death, if they're located in that same state and in that same area, it can be logistically easier to handle the terms of a trust, but certainly not required. And as far as choosing between states, no, it doesn't. I would always recommend having one's will align with a person's trust. So wherever their residence or domicile, if that's North Carolina, than having a North Carolina trust. It's not required, but it can just make it easier to align those two. And then the last part is if someone has real estate in more than one state, then that principle that I mentioned about real estate passing outside the terms of the will, that gets a little more complicated. And that's usually when I recommend having a revocable trust, because again, that transfers the title to the real estate instead of having to do probate now in more than one state.
Right, right. Okay. Dave had a question earlier that I can best phrase. Dave, correct me if this is wrong. Say, for example, I wanted to leave my money to a charity, for example, but I didn't want it to go to a person. Do I do that as like name the charity as a beneficiary, or would I hire an executor or a lawyer to create that flow, that situation? How would that work?
Great question. So the first question that I would have is depends on the property item itself. So if it was, let's say it was a financial account, like a retirement account, fortunately, most of them have a way to name nonprofits. Specifically on the beneficiary form. So it also includes their tax ID number so that whatever that account, however that account is managed at a person's death, the account manager would then see, okay, so this nonprofit receives this amount or this percentage share, and then they would be responsible for carrying that out if there's a beneficiary form. If there's not, and it's within a person's will, then that is where an executor would come into play, because that executor would then have the responsibility of distributing out that gift to the nonprofit or one or more. So that's another way that it can be done.
Okay.
So.
Dave, go ahead.
My question was, it's an IRA and I have a charity as a beneficiary. Does somebody have to tell the charity to go talk to what am I trying to say? Does the charity need to be notified that they need to talk to the IRA?
No, they don't. Oftentimes, charities will recommend that a person use their special language. But oftentimes the charity doesn't know until it's actually final. So at a person's death, they would then be informed by the executor.
Okay.
And then the executor would be responsible to work with the nonprofit. But it's not necessarily that the nonprofit would know ahead of time.
Awesome. What do you, Scott, think of a do-it-yourself online will template? What's your opinion about those?
Well, I'm a firm believer in do it yourself. I mean, that's really how I kind of got into this. And in a lot of cases, it can work great. I have noticed in some cases, it really depends on how state specific the documents are, and that can have an effect in different ways. There's certain North Carolina laws that aren't the same as South Carolina, and that can relate to everything from the amount of a person's gravestone that is automatically approved in North Carolina. That can also relate to how much the executor might get in compensation. So there are certain details that can be state specific that I have seen can be left out of some of the more nationwide kind of document drafters.
Awesome.
So it really depends, especially if someone wants to do something slightly different, then that's where it can come in helpful to have a will drafted.
Right. If you were, if someone from this class, like they spent a whole, semester taking this class and they wanted to feel empowered and do a lot of this themselves, would you be open to like reviewing everything as opposed to creating everything?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Certainly. And I generally, how I've always worked with folks is, I have an hourly rate and it's certainly sliding. So if somebody comes to me and they say, Scott, is there a way that we can do this differently? And that I'm very flexible in that way personally, where I could look at a document and say, this would be my recommendation, given that you want to do A, B, or C, or say, this looks great. I think you're good to go. So I'd be happy to do that.
Oh, Sarah, you worked with Scott? That's awesome. Sarah Davis here.
There. Aw.
Um, and then I have another question along those lines. Oh, Carla, she asks, if I have a trust, why do I also need a will? Could you slow down around that one again? I know you already did that, but.
No, great question. So usually a will is standalone. If a person has a trust, then essentially the trust is really the main vehicle or the main bucket that they want to transfer their property. But having a will can still be very necessary, like appointing an executor. So even if all of my property is in that trust, I might still want to appoint someone as my executor through my will. And then also there's almost always a catch-all provision in any will that's aligned with a trust. It's like a pour over. It says anything that I own in my own name that didn't go in my trust, go ahead and give it to the trustee of my trust and let them do what they will according to the terms of that trust. So
sort of a residuary kind of thing.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So like my clothes and my stuff and my furniture and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be anything that's not titled. So usually what I do is I'll draft an assignment of tangible personal property. This is just a 2-page document, but it's the person transferring title of their personal property into the name of their trust. So it's really any property interest that one might have missed or that came up after the fact that would then get transferred or poured over into the trust through the terms of the will at death.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is the biggest thing that you see families fight over? And if you were to give like a piece of advice for people ahead of time to like save everybody a headache at the end, what would you say?
Well, I'm all about transparency and just, opening up and shining a light, as hard as that might be. And I realize that, with issues of money, family, and death, I mean, those can be some pretty weighty topics. And I have found that the best way through them is straight through. So an individual, they now have a living reading of the will where somebody could come up with the terms of their will, and before their death, they basically sit down all of their loved ones and say, this is my intention, this is what I want. If you have any questions, ask them now. Sometimes that's a bit much for people to make that choice. So the next step is just certainty. The more clear and articulated and thought out and precise a person's intentions and instructions, then the less uncertainty there is. And that's usually what I find that creates conflict. Is there's some uncertainty where someone feels left out, whether they are or not, or there's some missing information, or there's some vacuum in authority. And then that causes people to sometimes insert their own preferences and agenda into the vacuum.
Right. Or a misunderstanding like, hey, dad said I could have this and then he gave it to you. And yeah, right. So transparency, that's really, really beautiful. Thank you. Sure. Are you only working in North Carolina, Scott, or do you work in other states too?
I am just in North Carolina. I am going to be in South Carolina probably by next fall.
Okay. Someone was asking about South Carolina, so that's great. Someone else asked, does my revocable trust need to be created in the state I claim as my personal residence? Do I need to rewrite in what I have as it was created in a different state?
I know it's not very, so it would depend if the out-of-state trust is specific to an asset that is not state dependent, for instance. So let me take an example that's not that. So if I have real estate in North Carolina, having a North Carolina trust can be helpful because then I know that the laws of the state would be consistent with where the real estate is located. But it's not by definition. It certainly doesn't have to be. The legal requirement, there just has to be some connection to the original state. So that could be a former residence. That could be where my trustee lives. That could be where I have real estate or property in that state. So all of those can really initiate the connection. But then oftentimes people will move. So it's certainly not by definition to have a new state specific trust, which is different from a will because the will gets admitted to probate. So there's a little more hoops and requirements to getting the court to approve it than there is with a trust, which again is a private document.
Awesome. What else? Other questions for Scott? It's a lot to take in.
It is. I know it is. It is. And yeah, and it's usually one of those processes that someone goes through maybe after a loved one has died, or a friend, that has experienced something similar that can motivate it. So taking, proactive action, I think is, the best course. And it's in the end, my experience is it saves a lot of time and expense for a person's loved ones, after death. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I used to think that it was just rich people and people with a ton of assets that had trusts, but I have since learned no, it's a different way to structure it.
Right.
So yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, I see Becky and Heather with questions. Go ahead, Becky.
So what Scott said most recently there was about the out-of-state trust versus the will, whether the trust needed to be in the state that you're living in versus the will. Could he just repeat that? Because I'm not quite sure I see if there's a difference between a trust and a will in terms of where you're a resident.
Great question. So the primary difference just between those two documents is the will ultimately has to get approved by the court. And so I'm working with a situation now where we had two signatures on a person's will, but one of them was the notary. And the law in North Carolina is you have to have two signatures, and they're usually notarized by an independent notary. And each state is different. Some states require two, some states require one, some states require more. So that kind of bottom line requirement, where a will is valid only if it meets the requirements usually of the state in which it was written, but usually the one that a person is in. A trust is different in that it's a private contract. And so it usually never is admitted to court. So they never have to vet it or review it and make sure that it's legal. The folks that usually do that are banks or real estate, agents in any kind of a transaction. So there's more flexibility with a trust than there is necessarily with a will. That since it's most likely a court document.
Oh, got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Heather.
Thank you so much, Scott. I also really appreciate your verbiage. I'm understanding a lot, I'm not having to navigate a lot of jargon. So thank you for expressing yourself with, easily so we can, digest this info. If I heard you correctly, a will always go through probate. Is that correct?
It will. There's some limited exceptions, but almost always if a person or if a person's loved ones want the will to take effect, then it has to go through probate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And I'm in South Carolina, so I might reach out to you when you're available in that state.
Sure. Yeah. It could be after the exam next July. So.
Sure thing. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's a whole, there's the whole question of protecting assets as you age. So, so it can be given to family or held in a trust so that it doesn't get dwindled if you need care, and like all that elder law stuff. That's like a whole different conversation that we're not going to have today because it's just too much. It's beyond our scope. But I do have a question from Anne Marie saying, do you recommend gifting actual money amounts or percentages, writing into your trust or leaving instructions for your executor? Seems like those are two different questions. Do you recommend gifting actual money amounts or percentages is one question. And then the other question is, do you write this into the trust or do you just leave instructions for an executor?
Great question. Whenever I draft a document, I do it with an eye towards, if nothing changes, it'll be valid for 30 years. And so the best way that I found to allow for like inflation is to name a percentage. So let's say in today's dollars, I wanted to give, a certain amount of money to my family members. I would go ahead and just calculate the relative percentage, because if I name a number, then obviously over time that potentially could change. So that's usually what I recommend, but it's certainly not required. And as far as that is definitely information to include in a will or a trust, because in a lot of ways, that's really the heart of what those documents are doing. There is another section of the wills that I draft that says I might leave a writing that names out certain, specific items of personal property, maybe family heirlooms or whatever it might be that's special that I want to go to certain people. And the will references that. And so that's a document that can be drafted on one's own. And then as long as it's with the will, the executor can use it without any liability, can be directed by it. But you don't have to include it necessarily at signing. And then you can update it later and just always make sure the most current version is with the will. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Wow. So concise and helpful. Any last questions for Scott? Jeff.
Okay, unmute myself. Thank you, Scott. Very interesting. I've got one specific personal question. I have a trust, and it was done years ago when my wife was alive. And so both our names are in it. She died 3 years ago. Do I need to rewrite the trust?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. If the trust accounted for one of your death, which I assume that it would, it likely then in your situation might have co-trustees. So your late wife and yourself might have been co-trustees. Usually then at a person's death, then the survivor might become the sole trustee, or within the terms of the trust, it might say, if my wife or if my husband has died before me, then do this. With the paragraph before it saying, if my wife or husband survives me, then do this. And so that's a way to account for, a couple's, deaths at different times.
Okay, but I don't have to rewrite it and take her name out because she's died.
No, and sometimes I'll have issues come up with people's banks or with other financial institutions on certain financial accounts because they get notified of our death, usually through the Social Security Administration. And so sometimes joint accounts with a late partner might flag a bank's attention, and they might say, wait a minute, you have an account in your trust. However, we know that your partner has passed. So they might try to force a solution, but depending on the terms of the trust, it doesn't, by definition need to be revised.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Sure.
Carl, you asked a question about two executors. Can you say more about why you would want two?
So often what I have found is if somebody wants and has two people that they want to have equal authority after their death, that can be siblings, it can also be children, and they don't want to have to choose or feel like they're excluding one over the other. then they might name co-executors. Similar kind of reasoning can come up with naming co-agents, like co-healthcare agents or co-financial general power of attorney agents. And it can be helpful in that way, most definitely psychologically. It does make it a bit more cumbersome because then each executor or each agent, they both have to sign off on whatever the decision might be. Now, that might be intentional, and that might be a very good thing with a person's estate if they question, you know what, I think my children are going to fight, and if I name one over the other, it will just increase the conflict. Well, naming them both really forces both of them to work together. So it's almost always a personal preference depending on a person's situation. But logistically, it's a lot more efficient to have one person that you trust make all those decisions, knowing that they'll be respected by your other loved ones.
That helps a lot. Thank you for the clarification.
Oh, you're welcome.
Wow, Scott, so grateful. So grateful. This was like Heather said, concise, efficient, lay people's terms. It was really a lot, and we can listen to a recording if we didn't catch it all. Anybody else? Any last questions for Scott?
I just put one in the chat, Scott. I was talking to other mental health therapists, and I have some friends who've created professional wills to essentially assign a person who would reach out to my clients if I died, and to also provide them referral options to ensure continuity of care. Is that something you highly recommend?
Certainly, yes. And that's a great point. Is that just as we can plan, for our death or incapacity, with our property, like a business interest is just the same. So, like the North Carolina bar has a way where we can appoint a trustee. If we become incompetent, they basically take over for us to help us kind of manage our practice before it gets closed. And so I would certainly having some kind of like succession planning. So naming a custodian that can handle case files, any like account receivables, anything that needs to be done to wind down the practice, or maybe just to keep it going if I'm in a period of incapacity. That can be really helpful. And depending on the nature of the business, sometimes that dictates the best document. So like some boards have specific requirements for how you name a successor or how you might name a custodian or trustee. So that might be a good place to get started, but certainly that can also be included in the terms of a will or trust.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How much money should people put aside for an end of life account where they maybe are paying their executor or making sure their funeral arrangements get covered? What do you recommend around that?
Yeah, that's a great point. There are products that can be somewhat helpful, but then also they can be very complicated. So like pre-need burial contracts can be something where a person can essentially prepay for their funeral service. Is something that I have seen some people do. Again, those contracts can be a little complex. If I was, and then also a burial space, if somebody was thinking proactively and they're certain they want to be buried, or if they want to name and articulate what their cremation or home burial might look like. Those can all be specified. So those are steps a person can do ahead of time. And as far as the amount, I mean, it can range in North Carolina. Unfortunately, funeral services could be up to 10,000. And then burial space might be a good 5 to 7. So, it could very well be 15, plus thousand in order to kind of go through with the process. Now, that all depends. Like my parents were cremated, and so the cost was a lot less.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And what about executors? Is is there an expectation that the executor would be paid for their work?
So if there's not something that specifies the amount that they get, the North Carolina law kicks in, and it's 5% of any of the property that was received by the estate. And that's the total amount that the executor could get in a commission. Now, oftentimes, if it's a pour over will, or if it's a group of family, the person making their will can always just exclude commission. They can say that my executor shall serve without compensation. Or they can say whatever's legal under the law, then that's what they can get. So it's designed to pay them for just the job of managing a person's estate, which can sometimes be a lot of work. And it is a consideration to make, if someone's wanting to leave their estate equally to children, for instance, then that would be something to consider, is by naming one child as executor, would they then receive an additional commission that would make their ultimate share, higher? So.
Right. Woo! This was fabulous. Thank you so much.
You're
so
welcome,
grateful,
Leah.
Scott.
You're welcome. I'm glad to do it. Glad to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Have a good day, my love.
Thank you, darling. Y'all have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Let's take a break and digest all that. See you back in 5 minutes. All right. What do y'all think of a breakout room? You need some time to talk about this and digest a little bit? How does that sound? Or would you rather stay here? People are still making their way back.
I'd like to stay here and hear something light and inspiring and beautiful from you. I need to. Thank you for asking.
Light and inspiring and beautiful.
Yes, you have so much of that.
Yeah, Scott was great though. That was amazing. So helpful. So helpful. I'd like to stay here and hear from people. Okay. What do we want to talk about? We need a break from all the financials. I guess what we'll do is we'll do the uncluttering stuff maybe next week, since that's another heavy topic.
Question.
Yeah, Carla, go ahead.
Well, I would like to hear people's thoughts on the transparency that Scott was mentioning, and that you had said earlier. If you're avoiding a conversation with a loved one that that they probably won't be happy with what you've put in your will, then maybe that's a tip, that there's going to be more turmoil and conflict after you die. So just like maybe talking about, just being brave and courageous around addressing, I guess, unfinished business with loved ones.
Yeah, how to have these conversations. Really good question. You may have ideas about that. I like what Scott was saying about the reading of the will, the living reading of the will. Oh, that was interesting. But it takes away from that Hollywood moment where, you see on movies where like the will is read and then everyone freaks out, And then they go to get their revenge and fix it and fight it and all those Hollywood moments. So much drama. Becky.
I want to share that when my mother, before she passed, because she had her own business, and then we also had another family business that had transferred to my brother after my grandfather died. My mother did sit us down for a couple of conversations with her lawyer, with her accountant, all 10 of us, without spouses, because that was sort of a complication in a way. But she did sit us down and she talked to us about what her plans were in terms of setting up her will and her trusts and the succession of her business and all of that, because her best friend had 4 children. And when her best friend passed, those children just had a horrible time fighting one another over the will. So, what was helpful to us in my mother having done that was, first of all, she explained to us why she was doing this and why this was so important to her was because she didn't want to see happen in her family what happened in her friend's family. And she also very clearly expressed to us that what was most important to her was her family and everyone being able to understand ahead of time what was going on. And it was really helpful to us because our family, in spite of the fact that we have some definite personality clashes and things like that, we knew that our mother wanted us to put our family first and our getting along first. And we were able to do that. And I think we were very, very fortunate in that we were able to do that. And I think that what she did in explaining and having these family meetings with us was what helped to allow us to do that.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, well, I think we can do this is going to take a while to integrate everything Scott said, and some of you may not even be dealing with will, some of you may. I think what I am going to do is take Mary Marty's advice and send you all into breakout rooms, but I want you to talk about either gratitudes, what you're grateful for in your life, or from the blessed giveaway perspective of what you're excited to pass on. How could something that you pass on benefit someone else? And before we go, and Anna, if you want to set up rooms, and we'll do 6 minutes with 2 people each. That way you just have a few minutes to share and get light. I just want to read this poem to you because it's our closing quote, but it's right in line with Mary Marty's request. Aldous Huxley from the book Island, and he says, "It's dark because you are trying too hard. Lightly, child, lightly. Learn to do everything lightly. Yes, feel lightly even though you're deeply feeling. Just lightly let things happen and lightly cope with them. I was so preposterously serious in those days, such a humorless little prig. Lightly, lightly. It's the best advice ever given me. When it comes to dying, even, nothing ponderous or pretentious or emphatic. No rhetoric, no tremolos, no self-conscious persona putting on its celebrated imitation of Christ or Little Nell. And of course, no theology, no metaphysics. Just the fact of dying and the fact of the clear light. Throw away your baggage and go forward. There are quicksands all about you, sucking at your feet, trying to suck you down into fear and self-pity and despair. That's why you must walk so lightly, lightly, my darling, on tiptoes and no luggage, not even a sponge bag, completely unencumbered." So, as with much of this end of life work, in one hand, we hold the importance of getting our paperwork in order and all of that. And on the other, can we give it all away? Can we move lightly into our own death? So focus on that. Let us know when you're ready to send people away, Anna. And where is she?
Ready. It's ready. I just need the
Okay.
time.
Great. Yeah, 6 minutes. And you're either going to talk about your gratitudes or how your giveaway can be delightful. How can your giveaway be delightful? And whenever you're ready, Anna. Hold on tightly, let go lightly. All right, let's share some gratitudes or some yummy giveaway stories. We spend our last few minutes just enjoying each other and feeling light. Hannah and James, nice to see you and your beautiful faces.
Oh my gosh.
Lenny, please. Yeah.
Yeah, Dave left me with a big smile on my face. We were talking about gratitude at the end, and he said, I like to look up at the sky and just remember that I'm a little dot. I loved it. Yeah. Thank you, Dave.
Yay.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Finances can be heavy, and it all doesn't matter, really, in the end. What else? Other gratitudes. Linda, you're unmuted. You want to share something?
Well, thank you for bringing this knowledgeable person for us. I learned a lot about trusts and wills from him. Thank you.
I did too. Oh, so great. I mean, you can look all day online, but someone who's dealing with it's so nice to be able to ask questions. Yeah. So grateful for
And
Scott.
to have the recording.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. 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 There's another lawyer. I think her name is Joanna Dykes Law Firm, also in North Carolina. Sorry, I don't have other state resources, but she is also one that I've spoken to and asked her a similar question, which is, you know, the people who take my course are, they want to do all the paperwork and then sort of run it by someone. They don't want to get more templates from you. And she's like, that's fine. I'll work with what people have and approve. And that's something you may, if you want a lawyer to look over everything, just say, listen, I want it this way. I want to do it myself and I want your guidance. So just find a lawyer who's willing to be relational in that way. And it's great, Sarah. I thought you used a different lawyer. I didn't realize you worked with Scott. Scott's great. Carl.
How long will we have access to the material after the class?
I don't plan on taking it down. So until I die, or my website changes or something.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, let's all breathe in gratitude for each other right now. Let's just look at each other's faces and feel so much gratitude for our beautiful group field here that we've all created. Oh, I love you all. Mm. Mm, 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 mm. Well, our class is over. I'm happy to stay and hang out, but blessings if you need to go, and see you next week. Bye.
Oh, Anne-Marie, can you hear me?
Yes.
I've got to go right now, and I'll be out until about 4 o'clock.
Okay. We can talk later.
Are you all buddies?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
I'm going to go lighten up.
Go lighten up, Mary. Go dance.
Well, I love the idea that you said, Lee, about the person that wanted to have all their belongings in the trunk of their car.
Yeah, yeah, that
That
was
felt
good.
really releasing,
Yeah.
light. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and do that. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.